everyone, it's Miriam with a Y. Let's do something different using the alcohol ink on glitter technique that I showed you in the video before this one. What we make today can be done on whatever scale you like, from a very small little piece to a rather large piece. But let's make a pretty piece of jewelry today, because I get asked a lot to show how to make jewelry. So let's do that today. And to make this really different, let's use UV resin. These are two different brands. I just pulled them out just to show you UV resin. I'll probably be using this one because this is an older bottle, and so I want to use this up before starting to use up the newer bottle. But this brand, this is Let's Resin's brand, is going to be easier to find because I don't think you can find this anymore. Any brand of UV resin will work just fine. Actually, 2-part resin can work for this too. It's just that you'd have to wait for it to cure, and you'd also be using such a small amount if you're making a piece of jewelry that I would recommend doing it with leftover resin from the end of a bigger resin project, because I would mix up 2-part resin and just for a piece of jewelry. I'm also going to be using a mini die cutter since we're making a smaller piece. But of course, if you're making something big, you can definitely use a full-size die cutter if you have one. Or you can just fussy cut or hand cut the mask that we'll be making. That'll make sense later on. I'm also going to be using Copic alcohol markers because they have brush nibs, and brush nibs are really, really useful for this particular technique. And I mean, any alcohol marker brand with a brush nib will be great. They don't have to be Copic's. And as I'm using the brush nibs later, I'll explain why that nib is by far the easiest to use. I'll be using a larger double stick adhesive than I used in the previous video. Even one that's just 2 inches or 2.5 inches is going to be sufficient for jewelry. It's just this is the size that I have. I like the Elizabeth Craft Designs brand. I also like the Score Tape brand. Those are the brands that I trust. And finally, for the glitter, I love Elizabeth Craft Designs glitter because it's so fine and it's just incredibly pretty. And it's the only brand of glitter that I trust to use with my the nibs of my markers, because this glitter is so fine that I know it will not damage the nibs of my markers. Other glitters, yeah, end up feeling like sandpaper. This kind of feels not like silk, but like velvet after you've burnished it. And then finally, the last thing will be like little jewelry parts, and I'll show you those as we start using them. Alrighty? So let's do this. The first thing I have to do is decide on the size and rough shape of the pendant I want to make. I've decided to make an oval drop, and I'll use one of these wire bezels for the shape, and I'll probably attach the bezel as well. I'm also going to need a base on which to build my pendant. And for my design, I'd like that base to be white. So I'm going to use a piece of Graphics opaque white craft plastic. If you have white Yupo, that'll work just as well. I've chosen plastic because it's a little stiff and I don't have to worry about like resin seeping in between the front and back and causing a wet look that could show. So being that this is plastic, I won't have that concern. Next step is to cover both sides of this piece of graphics with double-sided adhesive. Like I said, the brands of this type of tape that I've used and trust are Score Tape and Elizabeth Craft Designs. I don't need a piece that's going to cover the entire piece of graphics that I have here, just a piece big enough to cover the front and back of the area that the oval will cover. After covering both sides, I'll burnish the tape onto the graphics to make sure it's made the best possible contact. For ease, I folded the tape over the piece of plastic, but I actually need it to be two separate pieces, so I'm trimming off the fold. Let's play with some glitter now. Since we'll be coloring the glitter, I want one of the colorless glitters. I've chosen Elizabeth Craft Designs Cool Diamond because it goes especially well with blues. I'm removing the protective, I don't know, what I'm going to call release paper, because I really don't know what you call this, from one side of the tape-covered piece. And this is important. I'm saving this piece of release paper, and I'm not touching the now exposed sticky area. I can now add glitter to that sticky area, making sure all of the tape is covered. I brush off the excess, and with my finger, I'm burnishing the glitter to let it have the best contact, to smooth it out, and to make it glisten all the more. Because when you're burnishing, you're making all the tiny individual pieces of glitter lie down rather than be standing up on their edges. And it's the flat surface that's shiny. Now I want to create an interesting detail for my piece. So this is where the die cutter will come in. I went through my dies looking for a little detail that could fit in my pendant, and I chose this section of this particular die. Any design you like will work, and you also can cut one out by hand if you want. I now need to cut that detail out from the little piece of release paper that I saved earlier. Dies tend to slide all over this slick paper, so I'll place it in a copy paper sandwich, if you will, to keep it in place for the cut. Next, I'll position the die where I need it with the detail that I want over the area that includes the release paper, and I make my cut. The die will likely cut through all three layers, so you'll have some little details you might use for something else in the future. Who knows? You know how we crafters and artists save everything. Nothing's ever really garbage. Yeah, it's a problem. Tell me in the comments if you need a support group for that kind of thing too. I'm on my third sponsor. I might be a hopeless case. I save everything. Okay, all kidding aside, this is the piece we need. The detail cut from the release paper. Back to our pendant base. I remind myself where I'll be positioning the bezel, and then I get a feel for where in that bezel my branch detail could fit. And this looks good. Now I'll remove the release paper on this side and save this piece of release paper too. And I'll make sure not to touch the sticky again. Carefully, I'm adding my release paper branch detail to cover part of this sticky side where I had eyeballed it a minute ago. Now with this piece of release paper, I'll burnish the branch detail onto the sticky exposed side, because obviously I can't use my finger to burnish this down. I really want the branch detail to have the absolute best contact possible to this tape. With that done, now I can glitter the exposed sticky part. And can you guess the next step? If you said burnish this newly added glitter, you win. Okay, no actual prize, just the knowledge that you are glitter smart. Wear that badge proudly. Okay, now comes the coloring. I'm going for a dark to light blue fade, so darker on the periphery with a brighter center. The reason I'm using alcohol markers and not a paintbrush with alcohol ink is that the markers are obviously wet with ink, but they release less ink than a paintbrush might. If I do this with a paintbrush, I run the risk of ink seeping under this branch detail and ruining the effect that I'm after. Now, can it be done with a paintbrush? I'm going to say maybe, if done very carefully with very little ink. I also wouldn't recommend doing it with a bullet nib marker. A bullet nib is hard and will cut through the glitter on the tape. We need the softness of the brush nib so as to keep your glitter intact and undisturbed. Now, in reality, you really only need the brush nib when you're working close to the branch or whatever you cut out as far as not letting ink seep under. So let's say you were making a bigger piece like a coaster or something with this kind of technique. If you're far enough away from the cutout detail that you're going to be protecting, you can add color and not have to worry about it bleeding under the, release paper. But on a piece this small, there's really no such safe spot. The whole piece is really close to the detail piece. So I kind of have to use the brush markers to limit the amount of ink that gets close to it. Well, except maybe at the very top, but I definitely have to be careful everywhere else. Even with the marker, I'm being very gentle on the glitter and trying not to spend too much time in one spot so that the area doesn't get too wet and, again, leak under or kind of get gummy. I'm being gentle. That looks good, I think. What do you think? Okay, you get to guess the next step again. Yep, time to remove the branch detail and expose the sticky part underneath. This is where you hold your breath and you hope there was no bleeding. I don't think there should be any because I used markers. So, yeah. And we're good. So, let's glitter this section now too. Now, ordinarily, I'd burnish this glitter with my finger, but because there's blue ink around it, I run the chance of rubbing blue ink right onto my nice white branch. So instead, this time I'm going to burnish the new glitter with this release paper. It won't pick up ink like my finger might, so my branch will stay nice and white. How pretty is that? Love this. It's resin time. Like I said, I'm using UV resin. If you're not familiar, unlike two-part epoxy resin, UV resin does not require mixing. It's only one part that only cures when directly exposed to UV light, like from the sun or a UV lamp. Don't confuse UV resin with two-part epoxy resin that says something like on the label like UV stable or UV resistant or good for UV use, that sort of thing. That means the two-part resin has ingredients that protect it from the yellowing effect of UV light. So a good way to think about it is if it comes in a translucent or clear bottle, it is not UV resin. UV resin will always come in a very opaque bottle, most often jet black, to protect it from accidental exposure to light, which would pretty much cure all the resin in the bottle, and that's no good. And also, UV resin is considerably more expensive ounce for ounce compared to two-part epoxy. So it's something that you really only use on small pieces, like jewelry. I've put a thin layer of resin down within the bezel, and I'm spreading it over the entire area. My most important goal is to make sure the resin makes contact with the bezel. Most UV resin is pretty thick. So if your background is flat and your bezel is flat too, and there's not much resin inside the bezel, it'll stay within the bezel for a few minutes before wanting to, sneak out and leak out underneath the bezel. So I'm pretty good for what I'm doing. It won't go underneath. Once I'm happy with this layer, I'll cure it with a UV lamp. The choices for UV lamps, which are really made for the manicure industry, by the way, the choices are endless. Nowadays, most have LED bulbs. This little one, which has LED bulbs, is less than $6 and easy to position over things, or I can even hold it like a flashlight for tricky areas that might be under something where a bigger lamp might not fit. Since it's weaker than the bigger, higher wattage ones, all I have to do is let it run for 3 or so minutes rather than, say, 30 seconds if I want a full rock-hard cure. When this layer is cured and not at all sticky, I can start cutting out my piece. During that process of cutting, the bezel will pop off, which is what I want. That'll make sense in a second. I could try to pop off the bezel first myself, but honestly, doing it this way prevents my accidentally bending anything, like the plastic or the bezel. I need everything to stay very flat. Now that the bezel is off, I can see the cured, raised resin area. So now I'll aim to cut as close and flush to that outer edge of raised resin as possible. That really wouldn't be doable if the bezel was still in place. Now that I've cut out the piece and I've tried to cut it as flush to the sort of lip that I have, but it's not perfect. It's really hard to get the scissors totally up against it. So now what I'll do is I'm going to sand it down a little bit to have the graphics meet up perfectly with that lip. So I want you to see the lip. And while I'm filing, I'm going to make sure not to file this way. If I can file this way to a degree, but ideally I want to file this way. And the reason is this side, the tape with the glitter, doesn't have resin on it yet. So if I file this way, I could lift up the tape, and we definitely don't want that to happen. So I will file this way until I have a nice flush edge all the way around. And the other really important thing is I have to make sure that this layer is completely cured. If it's even a little bit sticky, while I'm filing, dust could settle on the sticky part, and that would not look pretty. So I really want to make sure that this is really nice and cured before I do my sanding. So I will do this. And you can see that I'm getting like a little bits to come off. After about 3 or 4 minutes of filing, I've got the edge really nice and flush. But what I want to do now is, just for last cleanup purposes, is take my file and from the back now kind of pull down along the edge just to get any little goobers like that off. And then, in a perfect world, I'm already nervous. Whenever I say that, I'm like, oh my gosh. I should never say that because I'm just setting myself up for like disaster. But assuming I did this right, I should put an asterisk on the screen now that says, yeah, results may vary. But yeah, it should, let's cross our fingers, fit into the bezel now without having to work too hard. I should be able to push down and have it sit in the bezel because everything is flush to the lip that was formed by the bezel. And it's looking like that's working. Woohoo! And the reason I want to do that is because doing that hides the white line that would be formed by the edge of the graphics. And then on the back, we have sort of a little shiny back, just so that the back isn't boring. And then the bezel fits all the way around, and then it fits all the way around in the front now too. And now we can resin the piece completely. I started with the back. Before starting, I double-checked to make sure the white edge was hidden by the bezel. I added a decent amount of resin to the back. Again, being thicker than, say, 2-part epoxy, surface tension is going to keep this nicely where you put it without much trouble. I can even go so far as to wrap some resin over the bezel to protect the sides from tarnishing, which is what I'm also going to do. The resin on the other side is raising this off the white graphics just enough to prevent me from having any overspill. Because remember, that lip kind of protruded beyond the bezel. So it's lifting this off this little white graphics that I'm resting on. Again, here I want this fully rock hard, not at all sticky cured, because I'm going to be flipping it over and resting it against something. So I want it to be unable to, first of all, stick to something or get damaged. With the back well cured, let's have fun with the front. First step is to clean it of any fingerprints, because I was handling this side a lot. And that's easily done with just a little isopropyl alcohol on a piece of tissue. Now, some of you eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed a few little dots on my work area earlier. Those are tiny little flat-backed rhinestones, which have an AB or iridescent finish. I'm going to add a few, because, you know, well, sparkly blingage is good, right? Bling is always good. Of course, you don't have to go full bling if you don't want to. But if you do, I gave myself a dollop of resin to work with and then added tiny dots of it to my piece where I think I'd like my rhinestones to go. And then I proceeded to add a rhinestone to each dot. The advantage of doing it this way is that I can rearrange these little rhinestones to my heart's content until I'm happy with the layout. Any little, dots of resin, they can cure later. It's not a problem. So I can make a mess of this with like little dots of resin all over the place. That's fine. I just want to position my rhinestones where I want them. And then I'll cure them in place. No need for a full cure. So 30 seconds was more than enough. With that done, I can resin the entire front without fear that I'll knock the rhinestones out of place as I work. Now, this is another decision that's entirely up to you. You can add just enough resin to cover the rhinestones, but permit the bumps to show, which will give your pendant like a texture. Or you can add enough resin to dome above the rhinestones altogether, either as one thick layer of resin or a couple of thin layers. I chose the dome option. Since I also went with a thick layer, it'll take a good 6 or more minutes to cure with the little lamp. This particular UV resin also cures under fluorescent UV lamps, and I've got a higher wattage one of those, but laziness has me just curing using this little one, because, it's right here. Look at how pretty this is. Oh my gosh. Now for our last step, adding a bail. Again, you have options. The easiest is using a glue-on bail, like one of these. You can definitely attach it with a glue like E6000 after the fact, but a possibly neater way is to attach it to the piece as you're adding the resin layer to the back. Because with the resin layer already there, there's a bit of a dome keeping the bail from sitting flush. And there's also like a gap. So instead, glue the bail onto the flat glitter-only layer so that it stays in place. And when the glue dries, add the resin so that it encases the bail. It'll be really strong and neat. For those unafraid of tools, and really that can be all of you, tools are our friends, I promise. If you have one, you can use a drill to give yourself a hole to attach your bail. That's what I'll do, using a really non-scary spring drill. But if a Dremel is a comfy thing for you, you can use that too. The nice thing about spring drills is they only go at the speed you give them, because they're manual. With a Sharpie, I'll mark where I want my hole to go. I'll then use something to make a little divot for the drill bit to sit in so that it doesn't slip on the slick resin surface. I'll set my piece on some scrap wood to prevent drilling into my much loved table. And then using the spring drill just requires pushing down on it. It'll spring back up by itself, and then I push down on it again. And I'll do that as much as needed. And then, look, we have a hole. How cool and easy was that? With that hole, you'll have lots of bail options. I'm opting for a simple pinch bail. Your options for more than just the bail are almost endless with this. I try to build a multi-option aspect into most projects on the channel. My goal is to give you starting points for your imaginations to run wild. I chose glitter on the back so that it wouldn't just be plain white plastic. But you could add an image instead. Or color the glitter on the back too. Or add embellishments back there and a double-sided bail like this pinch bail. And you can make the pendant reversible. Lots of options. Tell me in the comments what you thought of this project and whether you'd like to see more jewelry videos. If you do, tell me how deep into the jewelry world would you like to go? As many of you know, jewelry is what I know best. And after lots of foot dragging, I am open to adding jewelry to the channel. So please share your thoughts about it in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing from you. If you haven't seen the video before this one, I'll put it on the screen for you in a few seconds. You'll see even more details about coloring glitter with alcohol ink, either with paintbrushes and ink or alcohol markers. Make sure to catch that video if you haven't already. May the inks and resin be kind to you all. Go let your creative nature shine and be safe. See you soon. Bye now.